The October sun painted the Texas sky in shades of amber and gold as George Strait pulled his black pickup truck into the gravel parking lot of Pearsall General Hospital. The small town stretched out before him like a faded photograph, its dusty streets and weathered buildings unchanged since the 1980s, when he and Danny Harrison used to play late-night gigs at the local honky-tonks. The familiar scent of dry earth and mesquite carried on the warm breeze, bringing with it memories George thought he had buried beneath decades of fame and fortune. Inside the hospital, the sterile corridors echoed with the soft squeak of rubber soles on linoleum and the distant hum of medical equipment. George adjusted his black Stetson, hoping to blend in, but his imposing frame and recognizable face made anonymity nearly impossible. A young nurse behind the reception desk looked up from her paperwork, her eyes widening in recognition, before George placed a finger to his lips, requesting discretion. She nodded respectfully, understanding immediately. "Room 247, he murmured to himself, remembering the phone call from Rebecca Harrison 3 nights earlier. Her voice had been thick with exhaustion and barely contained grief when she explained that Danny had been hospitalized for 2 weeks, fighting an aggressive lung cancer that had spread to his liver and bones. "He doesn't have insurance, George. We've spent everything we had and borrowed against everything we own. The doctors say it might only be a matter of weeks." George paused outside the door, his weathered hand hovering over the brass handle. How long had it been since he'd seen Danny? 15 years? Maybe longer. The last time had been at a charity event in San Antonio, a brief backstage encounter filled with awkward small talk and hollow promises to get together soon. Both men knew those promises were as empty as the bottles they used to share after late-night shows. When he finally pushed open the door, what he saw nearly took his breath away. The man lying in the hospital bed was a shadow of the Danny Harrison he remembered. Where once there had been a robust frame built by years of ranch work and weekend gigs, now there was only skin stretched taut over prominent bones. The face that had always been quick to smile, especially when talking about music or his family, was now gaunt and pale. But when those familiar brown eyes met George's, a spark of the old Danny flickered to life. "Well, I'll be damned," Danny whispered, his voice raspy from the medication and the disease eating away at his lungs. "Either I'm hallucinating from all these pain pills, or the king of country just walked into my hospital room." George removed his hat, clutching it with both hands as he approached the bed slowly. The room was sparse. No flowers, no get-well cards, just a few family photos on the nightstand and Danny's old Fender bass guitar leaning against the corner, looking as worn and weathered as its owner. "Hey there, partner," George said softly, settling into the uncomfortable vinyl chair beside the bed. "Rebecca called me, said you were having a rough time." "Rough time," Danny repeated with a weak chuckle that turned into a coughing fit. "That's one way to put it. Cancer's got me by the throat, George. Doctors say it's stage 4, started in my lungs. Too many years of cigarettes and dusty honky-tonk air, I reckon." Through the small window, George could see the town's main street, where pickup trucks moved at a leisurely pace and people walked with the unhurried gait of those who had never lived anywhere else. It was a world away from Nashville's frantic energy, from recording studios and concert halls, from the constant pressure of maintaining a career that had made him a legend. "Tell me about the family," George said, needing to shift the conversation away from the elephant in the room. "How are Rebecca and the kids?" Danny's eyes lit up slightly. She's stronger than I ever deserved. Working double shifts at the clinic in Dilley, trying to keep up with the medical bills. Michael's been having a hard time since he lost his job at the feed store 6 months ago. Been drinking too much, fighting with his wife. And Jessica." Danny paused, pain flickering across his features. "She's been through a rough divorce, raising 2 little ones on her own while working at the diner and cleaning offices at night." "I'm sorry to hear that," George said, and he meant it. He remembered Michael and Jessica as children, always hanging around when the band practiced in the Harrison garage, their eyes wide with wonder as they watched their father play bass alongside the future king of country. "You know what the hardest part is?" Danny continued, staring at the ceiling tiles. "It's not the pain, though Lord knows there's plenty of that. It's knowing I'm leaving them with nothing but debt. Rebecca's been putting off her own medical needs. She's got arthritis in her hands, something fierce, but won't spend the money on treatment. Says we need every penny for my care." George felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the same feeling he'd had when he left Pearsall all those years ago, guitar case in hand and dreams bigger than Texas itself. He'd looked back once as he drove away, seeing Danny and Rebecca waving from their front porch, baby Michael in Rebecca's arms and little Jessica clinging to her father's leg. "The doctors mentioned some experimental treatments," George said carefully. "What did they tell you about those?" Danny's laugh was bitter. "Experimental treatments for experimental money. There's a clinical trial in Houston, new immunotherapy that might buy me some time, maybe even put me in remission. But it costs more than I made in 5 years working construction and playing weekend gigs." He turned his head to look directly at George. "But you didn't drive all the way down here to talk about my medical bills, did you? You came because we were friends, real friends, before all this happened to you." The weight of those words settled between them like dust after a summer storm. George remembered the nights they'd spent writing songs together, sharing dreams and fears over cheap beer and cheaper whiskey. Danny had been there when George's first marriage fell apart, had been the one to talk him out of giving up music entirely when the rejections from Nashville seemed endless. "I never forgot where I came from, Danny. Never forgot the people who believed in me before anyone else did." "I know that," Danny said softly. "I've watched your career, you know. Bought every album, watched you on TV whenever I could. Always felt proud, telling folks around town that I used to play bass for George Strait. Rebecca used to get embarrassed, said I was bragging too much." A nurse entered to check Danny's vitals, and George used the interruption to study his old friend more closely. The monitors showed numbers George didn't understand, but the steady beep of the heart rate machine and the oxygen tube under Danny's nose painted a clear picture of a man fighting a losing battle. "You remember Billy Carter?" Danny asked when they were alone again. "He came by a few weeks ago before I got real bad. He's been living rough, George. Lost his house in a poker game about 3 years back. Been sleeping in his truck when he can afford gas, or under bridges when he can't." George's heart sank. Billy had been their fiddle player, a talented musician with a weakness for gambling that had cost him opportunities time and time again. "Where is he now?" "Nobody knows for sure. Rebecca thinks she saw him panhandling outside the Walmart in Dilley last month. Looked like he'd aged 20 years. Danny's voice grew weaker as the pain medication began to take effect. "And Patty Anderson. You remember her?" George nodded. Patty had been Danny's girlfriend before Rebecca, a beautiful blonde with a voice like honey, who'd sung backup vocals for their little band. She'd had dreams of her own Nashville career. "She got mixed up with the wrong crowd after you left. Pills at first, then harder stuff. In and out of rehab, lost custody of her kids. Last I heard, she was living in a trailer park outside Jourdanton." The litany of broken dreams and shattered lives weighed heavily on George. These were people who had shared his journey, who had believed in the same dream of making it in music. While he had found success beyond his wildest imagination, they had been left behind, struggling with demons and circumstances that had slowly eroded their hopes. "And Bobby Mitchell?" George asked, remembering their old manager who had booked them gigs throughout South Texas. Danny's expression darkened. "Bobby's story might be the saddest of all. He tried to make it as a manager in Austin, worked with some bands that showed promise. But he made some bad investments, trusted the wrong people, lost his agency, his house, his marriage. His wife took the kids and moved to California. He lives in a one-room apartment above the old barber shop on Main Street, works part-time at the hardware store." As the afternoon sun slanted through the hospital window, casting long shadows across the linoleum floor, George felt the full weight of his success pressing down on him. He had achieved everything he'd ever dreamed of: platinum albums, sold-out stadium tours, a place in the Country Music Hall of Fame. But sitting in that hospital room, listening to the stories of the people he'd left behind, he wondered what those achievements were really worth. "Danny," he said finally, "I want to help. With the medical bills, with the experimental treatment, with whatever you need." Danny turned his head slowly, studying George's face. "I appreciate that. I really do. But I don't want your charity, George. We were partners once, equals. I won't be your pet project." "It wouldn't be charity," George said firmly. "It would be an investment. In a friend, in someone who helped shape the man I became." Before Danny could respond, the door opened and Rebecca Harrison walked in, carrying a small bouquet of wildflowers and a tired expression that spoke of too many sleepless nights and endless worry. She was still a beautiful woman at 55, but the stress of the past months had etched lines around her eyes and pulled at the corners of her mouth. Her face registered shock when she saw George sitting beside her husband's bed. "George Strait," she whispered, setting the flowers on the nightstand with trembling hands. I didn't know you were coming today." George stood and removed his hat. "Mrs. Harrison, Rebecca, you look good." She laughed shakily, smoothing her graying hair. "I look like hell, and we both know it. But thank you for coming. Danny's been talking about you more since he got sick, remembering the old days." "I was just telling George about the kids," Danny said, reaching for his wife's hand, "and about Billy and the others." Rebecca's expression grew pained. "It's been hard, watching everyone struggle. This town, it's not the same as when you boys used to play at the Broken Spoke. The economy's been rough, and people have been leaving for bigger cities. Those of us who stayed, well, we've had to make do." George watched the interaction between husband and wife, seeing the deep love and commitment that had sustained them through 40 years of marriage and countless hardships. It made him think of his own relationships, of the marriages that had failed under the pressure of his career, of the connections he'd let slip away in pursuit of fame. "Rebecca," he said gently, "I'd like to help with Danny's treatment. I know there are options that might give you more time together." She looked at her husband, then back at George, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "We can't accept that kind of help, George. It's too much to ask." "You're not asking," George replied. "I'm offering, and it's not just about the money. It's about doing right by people who were there for me when I had nothing." As the evening approached and visiting hours neared their end, George prepared to leave, but not before making a promise that would change all their lives. "I'm going to make some calls," he told them, "about the treatment in Houston, about getting you the best care available. But I also want to do something else. I want to get the old band back together, one last time, a benefit concert for Danny and for anyone else who needs help." Danny's eyes widened. "George, you can't be serious. Billy's a mess, Patty's got her problems, and Bobby, hell, I don't even know if he'd be interested." "Then we'll find out," George said firmly. "Music brought us together before. Maybe it can heal some wounds now." As he walked to his truck, under the emerging stars of the Texas sky, George felt a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced in years. The bright lights of Nashville suddenly seemed very far away, less important than the small-town hospital room where an old friend lay fighting for his life, surrounded by the love of a devoted wife and the weight of unfulfilled dreams. That night, George Strait, the king of country music, lay in his hotel room in San Antonio, staring at the ceiling and thinking not about his next album or tour, but about the phone calls he would make in the morning. Calls that would reunite a band, confront old demons, and perhaps prove that success meant nothing if you forgot the people who helped you achieve it. The morning sun cast harsh shadows across the parking lot of the Sunset Motel in Dili as George Strait sat in his pickup truck, staring at his cell phone. He'd been awake since dawn, making calls to doctors in Houston about Danny's treatment options, arranging for the best oncologists money could buy, but those calls had been the easy part. Now came the harder task, tracking down the remaining members of their old band. His first stop was Bobby Mitchell's apartment above Brennan's hardware store on Main Street. The building was a relic from the 1950s, its brick facade cracked and weathered, the metal fire escape rusted and sagging. George climbed the narrow exterior stairs, the steps creaking ominously under his weight. The door at the top was painted green, though most of the color had peeled away, to reveal gray primer underneath. He knocked 3 times before hearing movement inside. The door opened to reveal a man George almost didn't recognize. Bobby Mitchell had once been a sharp dresser, always wearing pressed shirts and polished boots, his dark hair slicked back and his confident smile ready to charm venue owners into booking their band. The man who answered the door bore little resemblance to that person. His hair was gray and unkempt, his clothes wrinkled and stained, his eyes hollow with the look of someone who had given up long ago. "Jesus Christ," Bobby whispered, gripping the doorframe for support. "George, is that really you?" "Hello, Bobby. Can I come in?" The apartment was a single room with a kitchenette, barely larger than some hotel bathrooms George had stayed in during his touring days. The furniture was garage sale quality, mismatched and worn. Newspapers and empty beer bottles covered every surface, and the smell of cigarettes and stale food hung heavy in the air. Bobby cleared a pile of clothes from a chair, gesturing for George to sit. "I'm sorry about the mess. I wasn't expecting the most famous man in Texas to show up at my door." "I came to talk about Danny," George said directly. "He's dying, Bobby. Cancer." The news hit Bobby like a physical blow. He sank onto his unmade bed, putting his head in his hands. "Shit. I heard he was sick, but I didn't know it was that bad. Rebecca must be going through hell." "She is. They both are, but that's not the only reason I'm here." George looked around the sparse room, seeing the guitar case in the corner, probably the only valuable thing Bobby still owned. "I want to put the band back together. One last time. A benefit concert to help Danny and anyone else who needs it." Bobby laughed bitterly. "The band? George, look at me. I'm 58 years old, living in a room above a hardware store, working part-time for minimum wage. I haven't played a gig in 5 years. My fingers don't work like they used to, and my voice is shot from too many cigarettes and too much cheap whiskey. I don't care about that," George said firmly. "I care about doing right by the people who believed in me when nobody else did. You booked us our first paying gigs, Bobby. You taught me about the music business, about how to work a crowd. You were like a big brother to all of us." Bobby's eyes filled with tears. "I failed you guys. After you made it big, I tried to recreate that magic with other bands, other musicians. But I made stupid decisions, trusted the wrong people. I lost everything, George. My business, my house, my family. Linda took the kids and moved to San Diego 15 years ago. I haven't seen my grandchildren." "That's the past," George said. "I'm talking about the future. Danny might not have much time left, but we can make it count. We can show him that the music we made together still matters." Before Bobby could respond, George's phone rang. It was Rebecca, her voice tense with worry. "George, have you seen the morning news? There's a reporter outside the hospital asking questions about you visiting Danny. Word's getting out." George closed his eyes, feeling the familiar weight of unwanted attention. "I'll handle it, Rebecca. Don't let them bother Danny." After ending the call, he turned back to Bobby. "I need your help finding Billy Carter and Patty Anderson. Do you know where they are?" Bobby nodded slowly. "Billy's been staying at the Salvation Army shelter in San Antonio when they have space. When they don't, he sleeps in Brackenridge Park or under the highway bridges. As for Patty, he paused, looking uncomfortable. She's in bad shape, George. Real bad. Last I heard, she was living with some dealer named Jake Rodriguez in a trailer park called Pine Valley, but that place is no joke. It's dangerous. I don't care how dangerous it is, George said. She's part of this family too. An hour later, George was driving through the streets of San Antonio, looking for any sign of Billy Carter. He'd checked the Salvation Army, but they said Billy hadn't been there in over a week. A volunteer suggested trying the parks or areas where the homeless population gathered. He found Billy sitting on a bench near the San Antonio River, feeding breadcrumbs to the ducks from a stale loaf he'd probably gotten from a church food bank. The man George remembered as energetic and full of music was now thin and weathered, his clothes dirty and too big for his shrinking frame. His once skilled hands, which could make a fiddle sing like an angel, now shook slightly as he scattered crumbs on the ground. "Billy!" George called softly, not wanting to startle him. Billy looked up, squinting against the morning sun. It took a moment for recognition to dawn in his bloodshot eyes. George Strait. Man, I must be hallucinating. I knew this day would come eventually." George sat down beside his old friend, ignoring the curious stares from joggers and tourists passing by. "How are you doing, buddy?" Billy laughed, but there was no humor in it. "How am I doing? Well, let's see. I lost my house in a poker game to a man named Rodriguez, who runs numbers for some very dangerous people. My wife left me after that, took our daughter and moved to Oregon. Haven't spoken to them in 3 years. I've been living on the streets, playing my fiddle for change when I can find venues that'll let me, and trying not to think about how badly I screwed up my life. I heard about Danny," Billy continued, his voice growing softer. "Bobby told me when I saw him last month. Cancer, right?" "Stage 4, George confirmed. "Billy, I want to ask you something, and I want you to really think about it before you answer. I want to put the band back together. One last time. A benefit concert for Danny." Billy stared at the river, watching the ducks paddle lazily in the murky water. "George, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but look at me. I'm a mess. I haven't had a drink in 4 days, and my hands are shaking so bad I can barely hold my fiddle, let alone play it." "We'll get you clean," George said. "I'll pay for rehab, for whatever you need. This isn't charity, Billy. It's about family, about the music that brought us all together." Billy was quiet for a long time, and George could see the war playing out in his weathered features, hope fighting against despair, pride battling with desperation. Finally, he spoke. "If I do this, if I try to get clean and play again, and I screw it up, I don't think I could handle disappointing you, disappointing Danny." "The only way you could disappoint us is by not trying," George replied. "We all made mistakes, Billy. I made plenty of my own. But it's never too late to do something right." Finding Patty Anderson proved even more challenging. Pine Valley Mobile Home Park was exactly as Bobby had described, dangerous, run down, and crawling with people who didn't want to be found. George parked his truck at the entrance, knowing his expensive vehicle would attract attention, but not caring. A group of young men in gang colors watched him suspiciously as he walked through the narrow lanes between trailers, looking for any sign of the woman who had once been their backup singer. He found her in trailer 47B, a rusted aluminum box that looked like it might collapse in the next strong wind. The woman who answered his knock was a ghost of the Patty Anderson he remembered. Her blonde hair was now streaked with gray and pulled back in a greasy ponytail. Her face, once beautiful enough to turn heads in every honky-tonk from Pearsall to Austin, was gaunt and marked with the telltale signs of long-term drug use. "Patty?" George said gently. She stared at him for a long moment, then began to laugh, a harsh, bitter sound that sent chills down his spine. "George Strait, the king of country music, standing at my trailer door. This has got to be a joke, or a really bad dream. Can we talk? About Danny? About the old days?" She stepped aside, letting him into the trailer. The interior was even worse than the outside. Dirty dishes everywhere, clothes scattered on the floor, the air thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, and something else George didn't want to identify. "You want something to drink?" Patty asked, moving a pile of laundry off a chair. "I've got beer, or if you're feeling adventurous, there's some tequila that might not be completely poison." "I'm fine, thanks. Patty, I know about your struggles. I know things have been hard." She laughed again, sitting heavily on a couch that had seen better days 20 years ago. "Hard? That's one way to put it. I've been arrested 6 times in the past 5 years. Lost custody of my kids when they were teenagers. Been in and out of rehab more times than I can count. But you didn't come here to listen to my sob story, did you? I came here because you're family," George said simply. "You were part of something special, Patty. We all were." "That was a long time ago," she replied, but George could hear the pain in her voice. "I'm not that person anymore. I can barely remember how to sing, let alone perform in front of people." "Danny's dying," George said bluntly. "Cancer. I want to put the band back together for one last concert, to help him, to help all of us remember who we used to be." The news about Danny seemed to sober her instantly. Tears began streaming down her cheeks, and she covered her face with her hands. "Danny Harrison is one of the few truly good men I've ever known. He tried to help me so many times over the years, even when Rebecca didn't want him to get involved." "Then help him now," George said. "I'll get you into the best treatment program money can buy. I'll make sure you have everything you need to get clean and stay clean. But I need you to want it, Patty. For yourself, not just for me or for Danny." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing mascara across her cheek. "I've tried to get clean before, George, so many times. I always end up right back here or someplace just like it. This time will be different," George promised. "This time, you'll have something to fight for. You'll have the music. You'll have us." As George drove back toward Pearsall that evening, his truck filled with the weight of the day's encounters, he thought about the band they used to be and the people they had become. Bobby living in poverty and shame above a hardware store, Billy homeless and struggling with addiction, Patty trapped in a cycle of drugs and despair, and Danny fighting cancer with dignity while his family faced financial ruin. They were broken, all of them, in different ways. But music had brought them together once before, when they were young and full of dreams. Maybe, just maybe, it could work some magic again. Maybe they could find a way to heal, not just their individual wounds, but the collective hurt they'd all been carrying for so many years. That night, as he sat in his hotel room making arrangements for treatment centers and benefit concert venues, George felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time, a sense of purpose that went beyond album sales and chart positions. This wasn't about his career or his legacy. This was about loyalty, about friendship, about proving that success meant nothing if you forgot the people who helped you achieve it. The road ahead would be difficult. Getting his friends clean and ready to perform would take time they might not have. But for the first time since he'd walked into that hospital room and seen Danny fighting for his life, George felt hope. They had been a family once, bound together by music and dreams. Now they would be a family again, bound together by love and the determination to make their final song count. 2 weeks had passed since George's visits to his old bandmates, and the wheels of change were slowly beginning to turn. Danny had been transferred to MD Anderson Cancer Center in Houston, where the best oncologists in the country were overseeing his treatment. The experimental immunotherapy was showing promising early results, giving the family their first glimpse of hope in months. Rebecca had taken a leave of absence from her job to be with her husband, and George had arranged for a comfortable apartment near the hospital where she could stay. The financial burden that had been crushing the Harrison family was lifted, but the emotional weight of Danny's illness remained heavy on everyone's hearts. In San Antonio, Billy Carter was 3 days into a 28-day rehabilitation program at Sunrise Recovery Center, one of the most respected treatment facilities in Texas. The withdrawal had been brutal. Shaking hands, night sweats, and a crushing anxiety that made him question whether he'd ever be able to play music again. But each day, he forced himself to remember why he was there. For Danny, for the band, and maybe most importantly, for himself. Dr. Martinez, Billy's counselor, was a patient woman in her 40s who had seen countless musicians struggle with addiction. She understood the unique pressures that came with a life in music. The late nights, the constant travel, the temptation that lurked in every venue. "Tell me about the gambling," she said during their afternoon session. "When did it stop being fun and start being a problem?" Billy stared out the window at the Texas hill country, his fingers unconsciously moving, as if he were playing an invisible fiddle. "It was never really fun, Doc. It was about the adrenaline, about feeling alive in a way that nothing else could match. When the band broke up and George went to Nashville, I felt empty, like the music had died inside me. Gambling filled that hole for a while. And now I'm scared as hell," Billy admitted. "Scared that I've lost whatever gift I had, that my hands will never be steady enough to play again. But I'm more scared of letting Danny down. He's the best man I know, and he's dying. If I can give him one last good performance, one last moment of the magic we used to create together, then maybe all this suffering will mean something." Meanwhile, in Austin, Patty Anderson was beginning her own journey towards sobriety at Cedar Springs Treatment Center. Her path was complicated by years of harder drug use, and the medical staff had warned George that her recovery would be neither quick nor certain. The first week had been a nightmare of physical withdrawal symptoms and psychological demons. Patty had tried to leave twice, stopped only by the security staff and her own flickering determination to honor Danny's memory while she still could. The woman who had once commanded stages with her powerful voice and magnetic presence was now reduced to shaking fits and overwhelming guilt about the choices that had brought her to this point. "I keep thinking about my kids," she told her therapist, Dr. Williams, during a particularly difficult session. "My daughter Sarah is 25 now, married, with a baby girl I've never met. My son Tommy, named after Danny Harrison actually, is 22 and in college. They won't even take my calls anymore." "Recovery isn't just about getting clean," Dr. Williams explained. "It's about rebuilding trust, starting with trusting yourself. Your children may not be ready to forgive you yet, but that doesn't mean you should give up on becoming the person they deserve to have as a mother." "What if it's too late?" Patty whispered. "What if I've destroyed everything that ever mattered?" "Then you create new meaning," the doctor replied. "You find a way to make the rest of your life count for something. Tell me about this concert you're preparing for." For the first time in their session, Patty's eyes lit up. Danny Harrison is the heart of our little band. He kept us grounded when George started getting attention from Nashville scouts. He never got jealous, never complained when it became obvious that George had something special that the rest of us didn't. Danny just wanted all of us to succeed. Back in Pearsall, Bobby Mitchell was going through his own transformation. George had hired him as the band's manager again, giving him a purpose and a paycheck for the first time in years. Bobby had thrown himself into organizing the benefit concert with an energy that surprised everyone, including himself. The venue George had chosen was the Majestic Theater in San Antonio, a historic venue that could hold 2,300 people. It was much larger than anywhere their little band had ever played, but George's involvement guaranteed a sellout crowd. Bobby spent his days on the phone, coordinating with sound engineers, lighting technicians, and the various other professionals required to put on a major concert. "It's like riding a bicycle," Bobby told George during one of their planning meetings. All those years managing bands, dealing with venues and promoters, it's all coming back. I forgot how much I loved this business when I wasn't screwing it up. George looked at his old friend, noting the change in his posture, the clarity in his eyes, the sense of purpose that had returned to his voice. You never screwed anything up with us, Bobby. You gave us our start. You believed in us when we were just a bunch of kids with guitars and dreams. I let my ego get the best of me later on, Bobby admitted. After you made it big, I thought I was some kind of genius, that I could turn anyone into a star. I took on clients I should have avoided, made deals that were too good to be true. But this time, I'm just focusing on doing right by the people who matter. The concert was scheduled for November 15th, exactly 1 month after George's first visit to Danny in the hospital. Tickets had sold out within hours of going on sale, with all proceeds going to a fund that would help Danny's family and provide assistance to other local musicians facing medical or financial hardships. As the date approached, George found himself spending more and more time in Houston, visiting Danny and keeping him updated on the preparations. The cancer treatment was working better than anyone had dared to hope. The tumors were shrinking and Danny's energy was slowly returning. He was still weak, still fighting the disease, but for the first time in months, he was talking about the future. You really think they can do it? Danny asked during one of George's visits. He was sitting up in bed, looking stronger than he had in weeks. Billy's been sober for 2 weeks now? And Patty, God, George, when I heard what had happened to her, it broke my heart. They're going to make it, George said, with a confidence he hoped was justified. Billy's counselor says he's one of the most determined patients she's ever worked with. And Patty, she's fighting harder than she's fought for anything in years. What about Bobby? George smiled. Bobby's like a man reborn. You should see him working on this concert. He's got spreadsheets, timelines, backup plans for backup plans. He's better at this job now than he ever was when we were kids. Danny leaned back against his pillows, a peaceful expression on his face. You know what this means to me, don't you? Not just the medical treatment, though I'm grateful for that beyond words, but bringing everyone back together. It's like you're giving me the chance to say goodbye properly, to close the circle. You're not saying goodbye, George said firmly. You're fighting this thing and you're going to win. Maybe, Danny replied, but either way, we're going to make music together one more time. Real music, the kind we used to make when we were young and thought we could conquer the world. On November 1st, 2 weeks before the concert, the band had their first rehearsal in over 20 years. They met at a small recording studio in San Antonio, the same one where they had made their only album back in 1983. The building looked exactly the same, though the equipment had been updated with modern technology. Billy arrived first, carrying his old fiddle case and looking nervous but determined. He had completed his rehabilitation program and was living in a sober housing facility, attending AA meetings daily and working with a sponsor who understood the unique challenges faced by musicians in recovery. Patty came next, accompanied by her counselor from Cedar Springs. She looked healthier than she had in years. Her color was better, her eyes were clearer, and she carried herself with something approaching the confidence she had once possessed. She was still in outpatient treatment and would be for months to come. But the change was remarkable. Bobby wheeled in Danny in a wheelchair, though Danny insisted he felt strong enough to walk. The cancer treatment had taken a toll on his body, but his spirit seemed renewed. He brought his old Fender bass, the same one that had been gathering dust in his hospital room corner. George arrived last, carrying his acoustic guitar and feeling more nervous than he had before any concert in his professional career. This wasn't about performing for thousands of fans or maintaining his reputation as the king of country music. This was about 5 friends reuniting after decades of separation, pain, and loss. The first few minutes were awkward, filled with tentative hellos and careful conversations about everything except what they were really there to do. Finally, Danny broke the ice by plugging in his bass and playing the opening riff to Whiskey River, one of their old standards. The sound was rusty at first. Billy's hands shook slightly as he raised his fiddle, and his first few notes were uncertain. Patty's voice cracked when she tried to hit the high harmonies that had once come so naturally. Bobby's rhythm guitar was tentative, as if he were afraid the strings might break under his touch, but George stepped up to the microphone and began to sing, his voice as rich and powerful as ever, and something magical happened. The years seemed to fall away, and suddenly they weren't middle-aged people dealing with cancer and addiction and failure. They were young musicians again, united by their love of music and their shared dreams. "Well, I'll be damned," Billy whispered when they finished the song. "We can still do this." "Like riding a bicycle," Patty added, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I thought I'd forgotten how to harmonize, but it's all still there." They spent the next 3 hours running through their old repertoire, relearning songs they hadn't played in decades. Some came back easily, muscle memory taking over. Others required work, patient reconstruction of arrangements they had once known by heart. But with each song, their confidence grew, and the magic that had made them special began to reassemble itself. "We need some new material too," George said during a break, "something that speaks to where we are now, not just where we were 20 years ago." Danny nodded from his wheelchair. "I've been working on something, a song about second chances, about how it's never too late to do something that matters." He began to play a gentle melody on his bass, humming a tune that was both melancholy and hopeful. "I love it," Patty said immediately. "Can I try some lyrics?" She closed her eyes and began to sing, her voice finding its way around the melody like water flowing downhill. "Time keeps moving like a freight train, carrying our dreams away, but sometimes the track curves backward to a place we've been before. And maybe, just maybe, we can find our way home." The room fell silent when she finished. Even the sound engineer, who had been pretending not to listen, stopped what he was doing and stared. "That's it," George said softly. "That's our new song." Over the next 2 weeks, they met every other day to rehearse. Danny's strength fluctuated. Some days he felt well enough to stand and play for hours. Other days the treatment left him exhausted and weak. But he never missed a session, determined to be ready for what might be his final performance. Billy's recovery continued to progress. The shaking in his hands diminished, and his playing became more confident with each rehearsal. His sponsor, a former musician named Carlos, who'd been sober for 15 years, often attended the sessions, providing support and reminding Billy that his sobriety was more important than any performance. Patty threw herself into the music with an intensity that worried her counselors, but ultimately proved therapeutic. She had always used drugs to cope with emotional pain, but now she was channeling those feelings into her singing. The vulnerability in her voice, the raw honesty of her delivery, made their old songs sound completely new. Bobby documented everything, not just for his own satisfaction, but because he understood they were creating something historically significant. This wasn't just a reunion concert. It was a story of redemption, of friendship, of the healing power of music. On November 10th, 5 days before the concert, they received devastating news. Michael Harrison, Danny's oldest son, had been arrested for drunk driving and vehicular assault. He had crashed his truck into another car, seriously injuring a young mother and her teenage daughter. The victims were hospitalized, and Michael was facing potential felony charges. Danny took the news hard, feeling guilty that his illness and the family's financial struggles had contributed to his son's drinking problem. "Maybe I should have been a better father," he told Rebecca as they sat in his hospital room. "Maybe if I'd paid more attention to the signs." "Don't you dare blame yourself," Rebecca said firmly. "Michael is a grown man who made a terrible choice. Yes, he's been struggling, but that doesn't make his actions your fault." George visited the family the next day, finding them devastated by the latest crisis. Jessica had taken time off from both her jobs to help deal with the legal situation, further straining the family's resources despite George's financial support. The joy and hope that had been building around the concert suddenly seemed overshadowed by this new tragedy. "I don't know if I can perform," Danny said, his voice heavy with grief. "How can I get up on stage and celebrate when my son has hurt innocent people, when he might go to prison?" "Because that's exactly when the music matters most," George replied. "When everything seems hopeless, when the world is falling apart, that's when we need to remember what connects us, what makes us human. Music doesn't solve everything, Danny, but it reminds us that we're not alone." Over the next few days, the band rallied around Danny and his family. Billy, drawing on his experience with AA and the support he'd received during his own recovery, helped arrange for Michael to enter a rehabilitation program before his trial. Patty, who understood the shame and guilt that Michael was feeling, visited him in jail and shared her own story of addiction and recovery. "Your father is one of the strongest men I know," she told Michael during their conversation. "He's fighting cancer, supporting his family, and preparing to perform in a concert that means everything to him. The best way you can honor him is to get sober and stay sober, no matter what happens with your legal situation." Bobby used his growing network of contacts in the music industry to quietly arrange for the best possible legal representation for Michael. He also helped coordinate a separate benefit fund for the family that Michael had injured, ensuring that their medical expenses would be covered regardless of the legal outcome. On November 14th, the day before the concert, the band held their final rehearsal. Danny was weak from his latest treatment, but he insisted on participating. They ran through their entire set list, including the new song that Patty had written, which they had decided to call "Finding Our Way Home." "Whatever happens tomorrow night," Danny said when they finished, "I want you all to know that this has been the best month of my life in 20 years. Not because of the medical treatment, though I'm grateful for that, but because you reminded me who I used to be, who I could still be." That evening, George sat alone in his hotel room, thinking about the journey that had brought them all to this point. A month ago, he had been a successful but somewhat disconnected superstar, going through the motions of a career that had given him everything he thought he wanted. Now, he was part of something bigger, something more meaningful than any award or achievement. His phone rang. It was Rebecca calling from the hospital. "George, I have news about the treatment," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "The doctors just reviewed Danny's latest scans. The tumors have shrunk by 70%. They're talking about the possibility of remission." George felt tears start to form in his eyes. "That's incredible news, Rebecca. How's Danny taking it?" "He's cautiously optimistic. Says he's not going to celebrate until after tomorrow night's concert. He wants to give everything he has to that performance, and then we'll worry about the future." After hanging up the phone, George looked out his hotel window at the lights of San Antonio. Tomorrow night, 5 friends would take the stage together for what might be their final performance. They had all been broken in different ways, by addiction, by poverty, by illness, by the cruel randomness of life. But they had found their way back to each other through music, through loyalty, through the understanding that some bonds are too strong to be severed by time or circumstance. The concert would be more than just a performance. It would be a celebration of survival, a testament to the power of friendship, and a reminder that it's never too late to make things right with the people who matter most. November 15th dawned gray and drizzly in San Antonio, with low clouds hanging over the city like a heavy blanket. George woke early in his hotel room, his stomach churning with a mixture of excitement and anxiety that he hadn't felt since his first Grand Ole Opry performance 30 years earlier. This wasn't about his career or his reputation anymore. It was about something far more important and far more fragile. At the hospital, Danny was receiving his final pre-concert medical check. The oncology team had been reluctant to approve his participation in the show, but the psychological benefits of performing with his old friends seemed to outweigh the physical risks. Dr. Patel, his primary oncologist, had agreed to have medical personnel on standby at the venue, just in case. "Your latest blood work looks good, Doctor," Patel told Danny as Rebecca helped him into his best suit, the same black jacket he had worn to his daughter's wedding 5 years earlier. "But I want you to promise me that if you feel any chest pain, any shortness of breath, any unusual symptoms at all, you'll signal for help immediately." "I promise, Doc," Danny replied, though they both knew that nothing short of a heart attack would keep him off that stage tonight. Across town, at the Sunrise Recovery halfway house, Billy Carter stood in front of a mirror, adjusting the string tie he hadn't worn in years. His hands were steady for the first time in months, and his eyes held a clarity that had been absent for far too long. His sponsor, Carlos, sat on the bed behind him, offering last-minute encouragement. "Remember what we talked about," Carlos said. "Tonight isn't about proving anything to anyone except yourself. It's about showing up, doing your best, and staying sober no matter what happens." "I know," Billy replied, picking up his fiddle case. "For the first time in 20 years, I'm not running toward something or away from something. I'm just present." At Cedar Springs Treatment Center, Patty Anderson was putting the finishing touches on her makeup, her hands shaking slightly from nerves rather than withdrawal. Her counselor, Dr. Williams, sat nearby, ready to provide support if needed. "How are you feeling?" Dr. Williams asked. "Terrified," Patty admitted. "What if I forget the words? What if my voice cracks? What if I disappoint everyone?" "What if you don't?" The counselor replied gently. "What if tonight goes exactly as it's supposed to and you give yourself permission to enjoy it?" Patty looked at her reflection, seeing not the broken woman who had answered her trailer door a month ago, but someone who looked remarkably like the confident young singer she had once been. "I keep thinking about my kids," she said, "about how they might see this if someone posts videos online. Part of me hopes they'll be proud, but another part is scared they'll think it's just another disappointment waiting to happen." "Recovery isn't about becoming perfect," Dr. Williams reminded her. "It's about becoming authentic. Tonight, you get to show the world who you really are, not who your addiction made you become." Meanwhile, Bobby Mitchell was at the Majestic Theater, overseeing the final sound checks and coordinating with the venue staff. He moved with the confidence of a man who had found his calling again, barking orders at roadies and checking equipment with the precision of a master craftsman. The years of failure and self-doubt seemed to have melted away, replaced by the focused energy of someone who knew exactly what needed to be done. "Mr. Mitchell," called James Rivera, the theater's house manager. "The press is starting to arrive. They're asking about interview opportunities with Mr. Strait and the band." Bobby shook his head. "No interviews tonight. This isn't about publicity or media coverage. This is about music and friendship. The story speaks for itself." By late afternoon, fans were already gathering outside the theater despite the continuing drizzle. Word had spread throughout South Texas about the reunion concert, and the crowd included not just George Strait fans, but longtime locals who remembered the band from their honky-tonk days. Some had driven hundreds of miles for the chance to witness what many were calling a once-in-a-lifetime event. Among the crowd was Elena Vasquez, now 53, and working as a high school music teacher in Pearsall. She had been 18 when she first heard the band play at the Broken Spoke, and their music had inspired her to pursue her own career in music education. "I never thought I'd see them all together again," she told her husband as they waited in line. "That band, they weren't just playing music, they were telling stories about all of us, about growing up in small Texas towns and dreaming of something bigger." Inside the theater, the band gathered for their final pre-show meeting. Danny looked frail but determined, his bass guitar strapped across his shoulder despite his weakened condition. Billy's hands were steady, his fiddle tuned to perfection. Patty wore a simple black dress that made her look elegant and timeless. Bobby stood behind his keyboard, ready to anchor the rhythm section that had once been the foundation of their sound. George looked at each of his friends, feeling a profound sense of gratitude and responsibility. "Before we go out there," he said, "I want you all to know that this is the most important performance of my life. Not because of the venue or the crowd, but because I'm sharing it with the people who made me who I am." "We wouldn't be anywhere else," Danny replied, his voice strong despite his physical weakness. "This is what we were meant to do, together." The opening act, a young country band from Austin, finished their set to enthusiastic applause. As the crew quickly reset the stage for the main event, George could hear the rumble of anticipation from the sold-out crowd. The Majestic Theatre, with its ornate ceiling and historic grandeur, seemed to hum with electricity. Bobby took the stage first, walking to the microphone with a confidence that belied his recent struggles. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the packed theater, 37 years ago, 5 friends started playing music together in honky-tonks and dance halls throughout South Texas. Tonight, we're here to celebrate not just that music, but the friendships that made it possible. Please welcome George Strait and the Texas Heartbreakers. The roar from the crowd was deafening as the 5 men took the stage together for the first time in over 2 decades. George waved to the audience, but his attention was focused on Danny, who moved slowly but deliberately to his position behind the bass guitar. Billy raised his fiddle, testing the sound levels one final time. Patty stood at her microphone, looking out at the sea of faces with a mixture of terror and joy. They opened with "Amarillo Morning," one of George's biggest hits and a song they had played together countless times in their youth. George's voice soared over the familiar melody, but it was the interplay between the instruments, Billy's soaring fiddle lines, Danny's steady bass foundation, Bobby's rhythmic guitar work that transformed the song into something magical. The crowd sang along to every word, but George could see that many people were crying. This wasn't just a concert. It was a celebration of resilience, of friendship, of the power of music to heal wounds that seemed too deep for any other medicine. They moved through their set with the precision of a well-oiled machine, despite the decades that had passed since their last performance together. The chair, "All My Exes Live in Texas," carried away. Each song was performed with an intensity and emotional depth that elevated them beyond mere entertainment. But it was when they performed "Finding Our Way Home," the new song that Patty had written during their rehearsals, that the evening reached its emotional peak. Her voice, weathered by years of hard living, but somehow made more beautiful by its vulnerability, carried lyrics that spoke to everyone in the audience who had ever lost their way and found it again. Time keeps moving like a freight train, carrying our dreams away, but sometimes the track curves backward to a place we've been before. And maybe, just maybe, we can find our way home. As the song built to its climax, with all 5 voices joining in harmony, Danny stepped forward from his bass guitar and took the microphone. His voice was weaker than it had once been, ravaged by cancer treatments and age, but it carried an emotional weight that silenced the entire theater. "This song," he said, pausing to catch his breath, "isn't just about finding your way back to a place. It's about finding your way back to the people who matter most, about second chances and forgiveness and the courage to try again, even when everyone tells you it's too late." He looked directly at George, then at each of his other bandmates. "A month ago, I was lying in a hospital bed, dying alone and broke, thinking that my life hadn't amounted to much. Tonight, I'm standing on this stage with my 4 best friends, playing music for all of you beautiful people, and I know that every day I've lived has been worth it for this moment." The audience erupted in applause, but Danny wasn't finished. But this concert isn't just about us. It's about everyone who's struggling, everyone who's lost their way, everyone who thinks it might be too late to make things right. Tonight, we're all finding our way home together. As they launched into their final song, "Does Fort Worth Ever Cross Your Mind?" the emotional weight of the evening seemed to settle over the theater like a warm blanket. George's voice carried all the pain and joy of the past month, all the regret and hope of a lifetime spent pursuing dreams. Billy's fiddle soared above the melody like a prayer, while Danny's bass provided the steady heartbeat that had always been the foundation of their sound. Patty's harmonies floated through the mix like angels singing, and Bobby's rhythm guitar tied everything together with the precision of a master craftsman. For 4 minutes and 37 seconds, the five friends created something that transcended mere music. They created a moment of pure human connection that touched every person in that theater. When the final note faded away, the silence stretched for several heartbeats before the entire audience rose to their feet in thunderous applause. But George wasn't looking at the crowd. He was looking at Danny, who had tears streaming down his face as he realized he had done something he thought might be impossible. He had lived to perform one more time with the people he loved most. As they took their bows together, George felt a profound sense of completion. The journey that had begun with 5 young men playing music in small-town Texas bars had come full circle. They had all been broken in different ways, but tonight they had proven that some things, friendship, loyalty, love, are stronger than time, stronger than failure, stronger even than death. The standing ovation continued for nearly 10 minutes, but eventually the band members had to leave the stage. As they gathered in the dressing room afterward, surrounded by well-wishers and family members, George realized that this wasn't an ending at all. It was a beginning, a chance for all of them to write new chapters in their lives, armed with the knowledge that they were not alone, that they had each other, and that the music they had created together would live forever. Danny collapsed into a chair, exhausted but exhilarated. Rebecca rushed to his side, checking his pulse and looking for any signs of distress, but she found only joy and satisfaction on her husband's face. "How do you feel?" she asked. Danny smiled, the same smile that had captured her heart 40 years earlier. "Like I just played the best show of my life with my 4 best friends, like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Outside the theater, the crowd was slow to disperse, as if no one wanted the magic of the evening to end. People stood in small groups, sharing memories of the performance and talking about the power of what they had just witnessed. Many had recorded portions of the show on their phones, but they all knew that no recording could capture the true essence of what had happened on that stage. Elena Vasquez stood with her husband in the light rain that had resumed after the show, both of them still processing what they had experienced. "I teach kids about music every day," she said. "But tonight reminded me why I fell in love with it in the first place. It's not about fame or money or even talent. It's about connection. It's about being human together." As the evening wound down and the various participants began to head home, George realized that his life had been fundamentally changed by the events of the past month. The king of country music would continue his career, would make more albums and play more concerts and accept more awards. But George Strait, the man, had been reminded of what really mattered. Not the applause or the accolades, but the relationships that give life its meaning. The 5 friends who had taken the stage together that night would never be the same people they had been a month earlier. They had all been transformed by their journey back to each other, by their willingness to face their demons and fight for something bigger than themselves. The music they had made together was beautiful, but the bonds they had renewed were even more precious. As George finally left the theater in the early hours of the morning, he looked back one more time at the marquee that read, "George Strait and the Texas Heartbreakers, one night only." Tomorrow, Those letters would be changed to advertise the next show, and the world would move on to other entertainments. But for those who had been there, for those who had witnessed 5 broken people find their way back to wholeness through the power of music and friendship, the memory would last forever. 3 months had passed since the night at the Majestic Theatre, and the ripple effects of that extraordinary performance continued to spread throughout South Texas and beyond. Videos of the concert, despite Bobby's attempts to keep it private, had found their way onto social media, where they quickly went viral. The raw emotion and obvious love between the 5 friends had touched millions of viewers who had never heard of the Texas Heartbreakers but recognized the universal language of redemption and second chances. George had returned to his regular touring schedule, but something fundamental had changed in his approach to his career. The massive stadiums and elaborate productions still drew enormous crowds, but he found himself incorporating more intimate moments into his shows, telling stories about friendship and loyalty that resonated deeply with audiences who sensed the authenticity behind his words. During a sold-out show in Dallas, he paused between songs to address the crowd directly. "Music has given me an incredible life," he said, his voice carrying easily through the arena. "But the most important thing it's ever given me is the reminder that we're all connected. That the person sitting next to you tonight might be fighting a battle you know nothing about, and maybe the song we're about to sing will give them the strength to keep fighting." The audience responded with an intensity that surprised even George's longtime band members. People weren't just listening to music anymore. They were participating in something larger, something that spoke to the hunger for genuine human connection in an increasingly digital world. Meanwhile, Danny's recovery had continued to exceed all medical expectations. The experimental immunotherapy had not only stopped the cancer's progression, but had actually achieved what doctors cautiously termed a complete remission. The tumors that had once threatened to kill him were now undetectable on his scans, and his strength was returning steadily. "It's like getting my life back," he told Rebecca, as they sat on the porch of their small house in Pearsall, watching the sun set over the familiar landscape of their youth. "But not the life I had before. Something better. Something that appreciates every single day as a gift." Rebecca had been able to return to work part-time, though Danny's medical bills had been completely covered by the fund that George had established. More importantly, the family's relationships had begun to heal in ways that seemed miraculous. Michael had completed his rehabilitation program and was working steadily at a construction company in San Antonio while attending AA meetings and performing community service as part of his legal agreement. The family he had injured in his drunk driving accident had made a full recovery, and in an extraordinary gesture of forgiveness, they had asked to meet him to let him know they harbored no ill will. "I've been where you are," the mother, Linda Martinez, had told Michael during their emotional meeting. "My brother struggled with alcoholism for years. The important thing is that you're getting help, that you're making amends for what you did. That takes real courage." Jessica's life had stabilized as well, though her journey was far from over. The financial pressure had been lifted, allowing her to quit one of her 2 jobs and spend more time with her children. She had also begun taking night classes at the local community college, working toward a nursing degree that would provide both purpose and security for her family's future. Billy Carter's transformation had been perhaps the most dramatic of all. Not only had he maintained his sobriety, but he had found a new calling as a music therapist working with other addicts and homeless individuals. The Salvation Army had hired him to lead music sessions at their rehabilitation center, where his combination of musical talent and hard-won wisdom made him uniquely effective at reaching people who had given up hope. "Music saved my life," he told a group of 20 men and women who were in various stages of recovery. Not because it made me famous or rich. I never achieved either of those things. But because it reminded me that I had something to offer the world, something that nobody could take away from me, no matter how far I fell. His fiddle playing had returned to its former excellence, perhaps even surpassed it, tempered now by life experience and emotional depth that had been absent in his younger years. He had reconnected with his daughter in Oregon, who had been amazed and moved by the video footage of the Majestic theater concert. "I never thought I'd see my father sober again," she told him during a tearful phone conversation. "I was so angry at you for so long, but watching you on that stage, I could see the man you used to be, the man I always hoped you could be again." Patty Anderson's recovery had been more gradual, marked by setbacks and small victories that reminded everyone involved why addiction was considered a lifelong disease rather than a temporary problem. But her progress was undeniable, and more importantly, it was grounded in genuine changes to her life and relationships rather than just the absence of drugs. She had reconnected with her children, though the process was slow and sometimes painful. Her daughter Sarah had agreed to let Patty meet her granddaughter for the first time, a moment that both women approached with equal measures of hope and trepidation. "She looks just like you did when you were little," Patty told her daughter as they sat in a park in Austin, watching the 3-year-old play on the swings. "I know I wasn't the mother you deserved, but I'm hoping I can be the grandmother she deserves." "One day at a time, Mom," Sarah replied, using the language of recovery that had become part of their family's vocabulary. "We'll see how it goes." Patty had also returned to music, not as a performer, but as a voice teacher working with young singers in the Austin area. Her own voice, while different than it had been in her youth, carried an emotional resonance that came from having lived through real pain and emerged stronger. "The best singers aren't the ones with perfect technique," she told her students. "They're the ones who have something real to say, who've experienced enough life to understand what the songs are really about." Bobby Mitchell had experienced perhaps the most unexpected transformation of all. The success of the benefit concert had brought him to the attention of several artists who were looking for experienced management. But he had turned down the larger opportunities in favor of focusing on local musicians who reminded him of his younger self. He had opened a small artist management company in San Antonio, specializing in helping struggling musicians navigate the business side of their careers while maintaining their artistic integrity. His office was a far cry from the spacious suite he had once occupied in Austin, but the satisfaction he derived from his work was immeasurably greater. "I made the mistake once of thinking that bigger was always better," he told a young songwriter who was considering a record deal that would have compromised his artistic vision. "But the most important thing you can do is stay true to yourself and the people who believe in you. Money and fame, those things come and go. Your integrity is something you can only lose once." As spring arrived in South Texas, the 5 friends found themselves drawn together again, not for another concert, but for a different kind of celebration. Danny's latest medical tests had confirmed that he remained in complete remission, a milestone that his doctors had said was possible but unlikely. To mark the occasion, they decided to return to where it all began, the Broken Spoke in Pearsall. The old honky-tonk had changed ownership several times since their youth, but the current owners, Maria and Carlos Gutierrez, had maintained its authentic atmosphere. When they learned about the significance of the venue to the reunited band, they offered to host a private gathering for the 5 friends and their families. On a warm Saturday evening in April, they found themselves back in the small room where they had played their first gigs together over 3 decades earlier. The stage was smaller than George remembered, the ceiling lower, the whole place more modest than his memory had suggested. But as they plugged in their instruments and began to play, it felt like coming home. They weren't performing for an audience this time, just for themselves and their loved ones. Rebecca sat at a table near the stage, her eyes bright with tears of joy as she watched her husband play bass with the energy and enthusiasm of a much younger man. Billy's sponsor, Carlos, was there, along with several other people from the recovery community who had become part of their extended family. Patty's daughter Sarah had driven down from Austin with her daughter, marking the first time 3 generations of their family had been together in years. Bobby's ex-wife Linda had surprised everyone by flying in from California with their grown children, a gesture of reconciliation that had left Bobby speechless with gratitude. Even Michael Harrison was there, sober and employed, and slowly rebuilding the relationships that his addiction had damaged. "You know what's funny?" George said during a break between songs. "When we were young and playing this same stage, we thought success meant getting out of here, getting to Nashville or Austin or somewhere bigger. But the real success was right here all along. The music we made together, the friendships we built, the way we took care of each other." Danny nodded, his bass guitar resting across his lap. "I spent a lot of years thinking I'd missed out on something by staying here while you went on to become famous, but I realize now that I got exactly what I needed. A good marriage, kids who turned out to be decent people despite their struggles, a community that knew my name and cared about my family. We all got what we needed," Billy added. "It just took us a while to understand what that was." As the evening progressed, they found themselves playing not just their old songs, but new material that reflected their current lives and perspectives. George had been writing again, inspired by the experiences of the past few months, and his new songs carried a depth and authenticity that reminded everyone why he had become such an enduring figure in country music. Patty contributed lyrics to several of the new songs, her words carrying the hard-won wisdom of someone who had lost everything and found her way back. Billy's fiddle playing wove through the melodies like a golden thread, connecting past and present in ways that seemed almost mystical. Bobby's rhythm guitar provided the steady foundation that held everything together, just as his friendship had provided stability for all of them during their darkest times. But it was Danny's bass playing that anchored the entire evening, his steady presence reminding everyone that some things endure despite the chaos and uncertainty of life. Every note he played seemed to carry the weight of gratitude for his recovered health, for his renewed friendships, for the simple miracle of being alive and making music with the people he loved most. As the night wound down and they played their final song together, a gentle ballad that George had written about the enduring power of friendship, the sense of completion was palpable. This wasn't an ending, but it was definitely a conclusion to a chapter that had begun in pain and uncertainty and finished in healing and hope. "I want to say something to all of you," George said, as they unplugged their instruments and prepared to leave. 3 months ago, I thought I was a successful man because I'd achieved everything I'd ever dreamed of professionally. But success isn't about what you accomplish for yourself. It's about what you can do for the people who matter to you. It's about showing up when someone needs you, even if it's been 20 years since you last spoke." He looked at each of his friends, his voice thick with emotion. "You guys didn't just save Danny's life with this reunion. You saved mine too. You reminded me who I used to be, who I could still be, and for that I'll be grateful for the rest of my days." As they stepped out into the warm Texas night, the 5 friends knew that their lives would continue to diverge. George would return to his touring schedule, Danny would focus on his health and family, Billy would continue his work in recovery, Patty would build on her progress one day at a time, and Bobby would nurture the next generation of musicians. But they also knew that they would never again let years pass without contact, that the bonds they had renewed were too precious to take for granted. The last image of that perfect evening was of 5 friends standing in the parking lot of the Broken Spoke, their arms around each other's shoulders, looking up at the brilliant canopy of stars that seemed to shine with special intensity over the small Texas town where their dreams had first taken flight. They had all been broken in different ways, but they had found their way back to wholeness through music, through loyalty, and through the understanding that some friendships are strong enough to survive anything, even time itself. In the months and years that followed, their story would be told and retold, inspiring other people to reach out to old friends, to mend broken relationships, to believe in the possibility of redemption even when all hope seemed lost. But for the 5 men who had lived it, the most important part of the story was not how it ended, but how it continued, in the daily choices they made to prioritize love over success, connection over fame, and friendship over everything else that the world told them was important. The heart of a cowboy, they had learned, wasn't measured by the size of the crowds he drew or the number of records he sold. It was measured by his willingness to show up for the people who mattered, to stand by them in their darkest hours, and to never forget that the greatest songs are the ones we sing together in harmony with the people we love.